Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here behind a big pile of machine guns. We've got a Degtyarev DP, or DP27, sometimes called a DP28, and we have a DPM. This is the modernized version of the Degtyarev, which was introduced or adopted in 1944 and saw some use in the latter bits of World War II. Now, what I want to do today is go through the changes between these two patterns, since we have examples of them both. This is actually an original live Degtyarev, and this is a semi-auto Smith Manufacturing Group DPM semi-auto. So first of all, I think it's important to point out that the development that went into the DPM didn't just happen at the moment in World War II when they decided it was time to upgrade the gun. No, instead, this was the result of development that had been, or experimentation that had been done in the late 1920s and all the way through the 1930s. There'd been a bunch of experimentation with ways to improve the gun. So probably one of the most famous ones is in the late 1930s, after encountering Japanese Type 11 machine guns, the Russians actually seriously considered adopting a version of the DP that had the Japanese Type 11 hopper feed mechanism built into it, which would have been bonkers. And there's a famous picture out there of the experimental version that they made up. Anyway, the good idea fairy did not win out that day, and the hopper feed was left alone in favor of retaining these 47-round Pan magazines. But there were a bunch of other experiments. So for one example, they tried to come up with a way to get rid of the barrel shroud to lighten up the gun. And doing that required moving the recoil spring, because on the original DP, the recoil spring, I guess it's on this one, is located around the gas piston inside the gas piston tube down here. Well, there were some experimental versions of the gun where they got rid of this tube entirely, got rid of the shroud on top. That forced them to relocate the recoil spring, and they relocated it here on the back of the receiver in the same place that we would see it put in the DPM. So what I'm getting at here is, by the time 1943, 1944 roll around, and there is the political motivation to improve the DP, it has a lot of the elements that they need are already there. They've already been experimented with, they've been tested, and it's just now a matter of assembling them together into a final product. So let's go ahead and take a look at these two side by side, and we'll touch on the 3 or 4 major elements that changed in the design. All right, I want to start by pointing out that the receiver elements of these two guns are fundamentally identical. They're not, strictly speaking, perfectly identical, and I'll show you a couple of the places where there are some minor differences, but they are functionally interchangeable, and so it is certainly possible to take a DP and update it to DPM configuration. So the receiver goes from here back to here. The grip assembly is a separate component that comes off. We'll take a look at that in a moment. The rear sights are the same. There were a couple iterations of rear sights, but by the time you got to World War II, they'd standardized on this pattern right here. So that's mostly what you'll see out there. All right, now for the changes. First off, the bipod. The bipod on the original Degtyarev is actually a clamp-on affair. So all I have to do is take off, well, loosen this wing nut here. Pop that down, pop that up, and I can just take the bipod assembly completely off the gun. Now, there were complaints about bipod assemblies being lost on Degtyarevs as a result of them being detachable. I suppose in many ways this isn't that much different from US BAR gunners ditching the bipods on their guns, although the DP bipod is significantly lighter than that of the BAR, and I would say more useful. It's quite difficult to shoot a DP from the shoulder without having a bipod. The BAR is much simpler. Anyway, the problem was bipods getting lost, and so the solution was a bipod attachment method that was not quick detach. So I've got a spare here to show you. What they did was bolt this thing in place using an inner and an outer piece. So this inner half circle sits inside the barrel shroud right there, and then the outer piece with the legs is bolted all the way through to attach to it. This does allow the gun a little bit of pivot, but not that much. Honestly, you actually got substantially more side-to-side pivot from the original DP bipods. Also, worth pointing out that neither this nor the original bipods had any sort of locking mechanism. So the legs go forward, but if you push into them, they will fold up rearward, and they are really quite awkward to carry. The original bipods were mounted a little bit farther forward, which helped them not interfere quite so much with the charging handle. And by the way, you can identify an original DP shroud because it's got this sort of shaped section right here where the bipod attaches. Now, the next element to look at is gun handling. So the original DPs had a traditional style of grip here, and they have a grip safety right there at the back of the trigger guard, and that is the only safety on the gun. It's just that. And personally, I find this kind of clumsy to use. It doesn't really fit my hand very well. I feel like I'm often at risk of not fully depressing it when I'm trying to shoot. And I suspect I'm not the only one who felt that way because the DPM fundamentally changed the handling of the gun by giving it a pistol grip. Now, I mentioned that a lot of this sort of developmental work was already done when World War II began. Well, a big part of that is because there were aircraft and tank versions of the Degtyarev that were made where they needed the stock to be collapsible. And so they got rid of this style of stock and gave the guns pistol grips to make them controllable inside the confines of an aircraft or a tank. So not that big a deal to attach or to adapt that aircraft and tank pistol grip to the standard infantry gun. Also, for the record, if this looks a little bit funky, it is because it is a Polish production kit. This one was manufactured after World War II in 1954. Now, this particular DPM is a semi-auto build, and so it has a safety over here that works with the semi-auto trigger. But the correct original setup on this spare grip frame of mine is a lever here that rotates 180 degrees around. So this is the safe position where the sear cannot drop all the way. And that is the fire position where it does. So there's no longer a grip safety on the DPM. You instead have a very positive manual safety. There is, by the way, no semi-auto selector switch on either pattern of these. They were relatively low rate of fire, and so they were just full auto only, no need for a specific semi-auto mechanism. Now, to show you the third and final major change, I'm going to disassemble this. So we've got a locking pin back here. Take that off, and then I can, there we go, I can pull off the lower assembly. That's all there is to it. This, in theory, would fit a monopod leg, although they didn't really ever use those much. And this gives you a gripping surface to hold your support hand, like so. And of course, an oiler bottle in the top. Here, by the way, is one of the subtle differences between the two guns. On the DP, we have this pin that goes clear through the receiver and the grip frame and threads into this side. On the DPM, you may notice that there is no additional hole in the left side of the receiver. We have the same disassembly screw, but when I take it out, you can see that it is only that long. All right, now we can pull the bolt carrier, op rod, gas piston, and recoil spring assembly out of the gun. And this was the third major change. So on the regular DP, this spring is down here sitting inside this tube, and it's very close to the barrel, and it's wrapped around the gas piston. And what they found, this is, by the way, how it compresses when you fire. What they found is that under serious sustained fire, this spring could lose its temper and the gun would stop working reliably because this spring was exposed to too much heat. Now, you'll often find people like exaggerating the effect of this sort of thing. You know, if you have a semi-automatic rifle set up this way, generally it's not an issue because you're just not putting that much ammunition through the gun in rapid succession. And generally on a simple shoulder rifle, there are other elements that will cause problems before something like a spring in this position would lose its temper. But on a light machine gun that's intended for significant sustained fire, this did actually turn out to be a problem. And so on the DPM, they relocated the spring to be in the back of the bolt instead of around the gas piston. All right, so we're going to pull out the spare set of parts to show this as well. No spring here. Instead, now the firing pin at the back of the bolt now has a big guide rod on it, and we have this spring tube retaining this mainspring. And so that is why you see this extension off the back of the receiver. Once again, this is something that was actually developed in the 1930s as part of an experimental design to lighten and change up the gun a bit. Wasn't used then, but it was available in concept to drop into what would become the DPM. Also, by the way, this is the hammer fire mechanism in the semi-auto DPM right there. So that spring just sits right in here. There's a little locking catch right there. You just push that in, rotate it around, and it creates an area to retain the mainspring of the gun, which is now no longer exposed to the heat from the barrel and the gas piston. Just to show you here, there's the firing pin from the DPM. And there's the firing pin from the regular DP. They are essentially identical from here forward. The DPM just adds this recoil spring guide rod onto the back. Now I'm going to take these out to the range and do some shooting because I'm curious to compare side by side the shooting characteristics of the two different patterns. And this is feasible because while the receivers aren't exactly perfectly identical, they are interchangeable. And so the DPM recoil assembly and grip assembly can be just dropped onto a regular DP receiver. So we're going to be able to do some shooting with the full auto one. Unfortunately, on YouTube, I can't show you guys that, so we'll be ending the video here. If you'd like to see the full version that includes the range footage, please consider heading over to the History of Weapons and War app. I have a link to the full video in the description text below. History of Weapons and War is a subscription-only app that hosts 8 different firearms historical educational channels. We're actually working on expanding that right now. We're going to be bringing in a couple more channels. Won't give you any spoilers on that, but they're coming in the not too distant future. And it's a way to help support these channels against continuing censorship of firearms content on YouTube. There's a lot of good historical information out there and a bunch of small channels that could use your support. So anyway, if you don't want to totally understand, hopefully you enjoyed this part, and thanks for watching.